Good afternoon, and welcome to the Huxley Speaker Series. My name is Stefan Freeland. I'm the coordinator, and today is my privilege to turn it over to Teresa Warburton, Associate Professor over at English at Western, who is going to introduce our guest speaker today. So thank you, Teresa.
Thank you. I'm so excited to introduce Ruth Miller. I'm not going to do too long of an introduction. I just want to tell you that one of the first times I met Ruth, she came to my office and wanted to talk about fry bread and talk about how comforting it was, but also this long, complicated history that it has and how she'd seen it in all of these different communities that she'd visited with around the globe. And so when I think of Ruth, those are some things that I think of. I think of how comforting she is, how able she's so able to deal with complicated histories and to think through them, and how you can find her all around the world doing all kinds of different things. And I'm so excited for her talk today, especially on the eve of Treaty Day here in the Pacific Northwest, a day when we think about our responsibilities as parties to the Treaty of Point Elliott and everything it contains. So thank you so much for joining us, Ruth, and it's a pleasure to have you here.
Chicken Professor Warburton, thank you so much. That's a very generous introduction, but it's true that I do spend a lot of my time talking about fry bread. Yahlidu, everyone. Dena'ina kanaga shalkun kanash u shivaik isench iji. Ruth Miller gustanish iji u degeka kshu yastuda. Eko kasnin chugushakaeki landa chakayang asnanish ite. Shidaznaka Heather Kendall Miller shumta. Chu Lloyd Miller stukta. Chikanek chinan lukot sitsna elnin hadatul. Chikanek hadikiriki. Yati henu bagut yahli et sette. Greetings, everyone. My English name is Ruth Miller, and my Dena'ina name is Shivaik Isen, which was given to me by a very, very special elder dear to my heart named Danita Slauson of Tyonek Village, and means whirlwind woman. I am a Dena'ina Athabascan woman from the Yurok Tribe of the Lake Clark region with some roots in Bristol Bay, where we went downriver about 3 generations ago. I'm also Ashkenazi Jewish on my father's side and honor that heritage. I am named for a number of matriarchs in my family. And in my traditional introduction, I brought my ancestors into this space to meet with all of you. It is an absolute honor and a privilege and very intimidating to be here speaking with some of my greatest role models, including Professor Teresa Warburton and Professor Mary Tuti Baker. And so the first obligation that I have to my land and to my people is to name that I'm calling you today from my homelands here on Dena'ina lands of Anchorage, Alaska. The traditional name of this meeting place is Dikeyekak. And I encourage all of you, if you do not know yet, certainly to research the Indigenous stewards that for millennia have shepherded and cared for the lands and waters and animals of your region and still today do the same. It is imperative that each of us, whether on our own traditional homelands or guests on other people's homelands, take seriously the respect and the compassion we must show the earth that cares for us and gives us so much daily. So the first step to doing that is understanding your relationship and your positionality with the lands you're standing on and the people who have cared for them so that you can be there today. So throughout this, I really resisted doing any slides or taking too much time to I don't know, you guys can do whatever feels good to your body. Take care of yourself, stretch, do something with your hands. Professor Warburton will know that a lot of her class I spent beating when I didn't have the strength or the energy left to speak. Google pieces that are new to you. I will be showing you some pieces and leading us through a bit of a somatic exercise to get the blood flowing just a little. But that is what you can expect visually. And I also want to presence that I have a particular love for the Salish Sea in the region that all of you have come to know and hopefully love. Although I have yet to visit it in person, one of the greatest mentors and dearest friends of my life, Josh Monette, it was a Makah man from Nia Bay, and he was a very, very dear person very compassionate, very strong, but most importantly, he was a cultural bearer to his people. And growing up on the Makah Reservation, very near where your school is built, he pledged to revitalize his language. Unfortunately, he left this world when we were 19, but his legacy and his presence in my life is still very, very living. And it was he that initially inspired me to learn my Dena'ina language, which left my family a few years ago. So I'm particularly feeling warm-hearted to be here speaking with all of you. So the first thing that we're going to do is an element of somatics that I think is really important. I also challenge myself really to break down barriers to the language that I use. So somatics are movements that encourage your mind and body to be in conversation with one another. And so this was an exercise that was gifted to me by a good sister of mine, Danielle Stickman. She's also a Dena'ina woman from Non-Dalton. And so for those that are able, you are invited to stand. For those that would prefer, please stay sitting, whatever is most comfortable to you. And if you'd like to take this exercise, just closing your eyes and in your body and not moving at all, that is perfectly great. So I ask for your trust a little bit. And if you feel comfortable, you're welcome to close your eyes. And so first I want us to take a couple deep breaths. I personally hate Zoom and have a rather large vendetta against the fact that I have to sit in front of my laptop all the time these days. And so I found it's really important to me to bring my values and my culture into the way that I do speaking like this. And so as you close your eyes and start to feel your body, maybe you'll start to sway a little bit. The first thing I want us to think about is water. Many of us know that water is life. Many of us understand the weight and the gravity that a statement like that brings. Water is not just a majority of what lies within us, it's also a majority of what lies around us and outside of us. I want to invite everyone to think of a happy memory when you were held by water, our first mother, when you were embraced by water, maybe in your bathtub, maybe out swimming in the ocean. And now we're going to imagine ourselves in the slow, powerful waves of Bristol Bay, where my family comes from. There, the waves are gray. The movement is slow but steady, and it can change in a heartbeat. As we watch the clouds and the weather come in, our fishermen understand the impact that our changing ecosystem has on the way we treat our water and the safety we use when we're on our water, the impacts it has on the marine ecosystem that depends on our water. And so now that we're connecting our spirit with that water, we're going to start to move a little bit faster. Maybe move your arms a little bit. Just be that water. Maybe we'll start to travel up a river. Maybe we'll start to explore a tributary. And suddenly we will come across a fisherman reeling in his set net. The spirit that we're holding in this water, shaking out our arms, is going to hop to the fisherman. And now we're going to reach down and pull in our set net. So I want everyone to reach and pull. Just kind of stretch out, reach and pull in our set net. And there's some really, really big salmon in our set net. So we're going to have to really, really pull, maybe go a bit faster because you're hungry, you want to go home for dinner. And now we're going to start picking the fish out of our set net like this. You don't do that. Don't throw them over your shoulder. They'll fall out of the boat. But we're going to pick our fish like this. And then we're going to bend down and we're going to thank these fish like this. Whatever movements come to you, that's great. We're going to look at these fish and suddenly our spirit is going to move into that fish. And so now we're a fish. We feel our slippery skin. We feel the strong, powerful muscles. We feel our healthy fat that keeps us insulated from the cold. We're going to hop out of the boat and start to swim. We're going to swim up a tributary, maybe to Lake Clark and visit Ruth's ancestors. We're going to keep swimming. We're going to get to a waterfall, so we're going to swim faster, jump over the waterfall. There aren't any dams in this river. And now, as we're nearing the end of our life cycle, we're getting to the end of our fat stores, we're going to slow down and we're going to start to reflect on the journey, all the relations that we met, the relatives that we spent time with as the spirit. We're going to start to move our hands together like this. And as we feel our colors changing, as we feel all of our energy going into the salmon row, that will soon become the next generation, the next life cycle of Shika, of salmon. We're going to rub our hands even faster and faster and faster as our spirit gains energy. And at my cue, we're going to clap and we're going to put our hands over our eyes. So 1, 2, 3, clap and over your eyes. That heat that you feel just moved through your body, through the water, through a fisherman bringing home dinner, through a salmon, and back into spirit. That heat on the inside of your hands is now energy coming back to us. And that's the energy that we're going to bring to this talk today. That's what we're going to speak on. So for those of you that had closed your eyes, feel free to open them. For those of you that pieced out because you weren't game to try that with me, that's fine. Come on back. We're going to talk more. And I'm really happy that we could take that moment together to be in our bodies a little bit. And so that energy, that heat that you felt on the outsides of your eyes and the palms of your hands is the core that brings together this conversation about salmon in the Pacific Northwest that we're going to discuss. I wrote in the prompt for this talk, what is the meaning of a canoe, a fish camp, a dam? What is the significance of a salmon? What's the significance of a salmon to me, who clearly has so much love and appreciation for Ashika, versus the significance of a salmon to a development corporation? Today, I am the climate justice organizer for a matriarchal Indigenous-led nonprofit called Native Movement. And I have spent the greater part of my grown years fighting on the front lines for climate justice. Professor Warburton can attest to how exhausted and tiring it was to be a student, to do my undergrad at Brown University with her under her tutelage, and to also feel so compelled to be present in my home, to be present for my people and my community. There is no way, in my view, and in my culture, to separate the impact, the spirit, the history that a land has on its descendants, its people. And so through my climate justice advocacy, though I have traveled multiple times to the United Nations, to global climate accords, I've worked extensively on the Green New Deal with a variety of Arctic international partners, all of my stories always come back to my very first day at work with United Tribes of Bristol Bay in my home region when I was 15. In Dillingham in Bristol Bay, I sat in the harbor in a falling apart shipping container, waiting to talk to fishermen about the proposed pebble mine and hoping to encourage them to testify for upcoming EPA hearings, telling them about postcards they could send to their representatives. And in that work, I saw the power of collective storytelling and the trueness of lived experience and the way our peoples and those who come as guests to our lands grow to love and defend them, because they understand the multiplicity of ways that we depend on the health of our ecosystem. But my first day of work, I did not go into the office. Instead, I woke up. The auntie that I was staying with told me that the fish had hit the net, and I called it my boss. And within a heartbeat, she gave me the answer I knew that she would give me. She said, go, you must help. And so my first day of work, advocating against Pebble Mine, I spent cutting fish, hauling in the most beautiful, big, red king salmon that you've ever seen, or maybe haven't seen, and processing them, cutting them, brining them, drying them, smoking them, canning them, so that the family that I was with, so that we would all be able to eat and put away food for the winter. The core of protecting the bay was not only showing up to do the important advocacy on paper, but it also meant honoring the salmon we were fighting to defend and loving them as we brought them into our bodies and into our smokehouses. So now I want to take a moment and do a bit of a poll, if that would be possible, Steph. Would it be possible to do our poll now? Great, here we go. So what do you think of when you hear fish camp? I promise this isn't a quiz. You've got 5 options here. And as I begin to tell you about the significance of fish camp, I also want to tell you about the significance of hlika, our salmon. Our hlika becomes smoked salmon that in jars looks like this. This stuff is more precious than gold, is what we say here at home. This is sockeye salmon that was canned in August of 2020. And it is a statewide favorite food, but there are also so many other subsistence forms that our salmon sacrifice themselves so that we can create. That being fish skin leather. This is fish skin that I tanned with black tea this past year. And it kind of feels like a thick suede because I haven't softened it yet. This is another one that I did with a different tannin, like this. And the reason why I'm showing you all this is because if we were able to gather in person, I'd hope that we would be in a circle. I would hope that I'd be able to show these things to you. I hope that I'd be able to tell you about the way we tan fish skin so that we can make baskets. This is a cup, a basket that I made with fish skin this year and sinew, and even little earrings. These are made with salmon vertebrae and buoys that wash up on shore. And so as we get into more the dialectical life of what the significance of salmon is for those that rely on the fish, I want us to challenge our exploration of what it means to love a salmon, to know a salmon. Okay, so most of you got the answer right. However, I would say that all of the answers are right except for summer camp for fish. Fish camp is an ancestral tradition. It is a culturally informed technology that allows just and sustainable food systems. Fish camp communicates times for storytelling, but also endless hard work. For those that might have visited Alaska in the summer, you would know that the sun doesn't really go down, which means there's really no end to the workday. And so when we talk about the significance of a fish camp, we mean a subsistence site that has often been passed down from family member to family member, where the family gather every year, oftentimes in the fall, to process fish from a specific place. The fish camp of my family left my family 2 generations ago during the 1918 pandemic. And the reason why I've started this introduction this way, as we get into the Pacific Northwest and this juxtaposition of multiple communities that engage with salmon in creative ways, it's important to begin with this object, this moment, this experience, this everything that fish camps are. 2 of the tribes and communities that we're going to talk about today, the Lummi Nation and the Salish tribes, do not have fish camps anymore. So they come to Bristol Bay to live this experience. So it also is an object that represents loss. It represents both abundance and scarcity. It represents food security and the threat of not having it anymore, food insecurity. So I began earlier this year working with some incredible individuals, Becca, Jason, and Julian, who are the core team of the Natural History Museum nonprofit. The Natural History Museum, which while I talk, feel free to Google them, naturalhistorymuseum.org, has launched a powerful visual narrative project that brings together the communities that were advertised in this talk, the Yurok Tribe, the Nez Perce Tribe, the Lummi Tribe, and the tribes of Bristol Bay. I should have clarified earlier that my region, Bristol Bay, is home to a multiplicity of different tribes, including my people, the Dena'ina, the Yupik, and the Alutiiq peoples. So as we bring together these stories of our 4 distinct bioregions, we explore the way that their resistance to development projects is posited both in contradiction and as an act of resistance established by cultural objects. These cultural objects, such as fish camp, communicate cultural preservation and subsistence food systems that are threatened physically by the development project, but also pose a resistance dialectically to the colonial worldviews and the reductionism of Western ways of thinking that limit a fish camp to just being a place where you fish. So what we hope to do is explore material culture through lived experience, through cultural resilience. And specifically, I want to note that this project is struggle-centric. The fight in my home region, led by the Yupik, Dena'ina, and Alutiiq communities, is to stop the proposed pebble mine. I'll be speaking more on this later, but this fight has been ongoing for about 30 years, and the pebble mine would be the largest open pit mine on the continent, a copper and gold mine that would be devastating, not just to the last great salmon fishery in the world, but to the 14,000 sports fishermen and commercial fishermen jobs that rely on it. The second place that we'll be examining is a Lummi tribe-led effort to protect the critically endangered orcas of the Salish Sea and the Chinook salmon that those orcas and the marine ecosystem need to survive. The third is a campaign to breach the Snake River dams and restore salmon for the Nez Perce Tribe, who have been separated from their salmon for decades. And fourth is the Yurok Tribe's battle to win the largest dam removal in US history. So the way that the Natural History Museum project intends to unite these four narratives is predominantly online, integrating these stories into interactive platforms with dialogue, with interviews, with clips, with footage, as well as a standalone story that can be published to communicate this work and our analytical approach to this work in a written way. So we will have exchanging exhibitions with strategic timing to impact real world decision making, particularly thinking about elections, even internal tribal elections. And the reason that we focus on these four places, the Snake River dams, the Klamath River dams, Lummi Salish Sea campaign, and the Pebble Mine, is to focus and center and elevate the native voice and perspective that will be the storytelling anchor. The way that our communities, these communities, mine and these three others, engage with these objects, not just tells a story of cultural revitalization as we rediscover techniques for loving and building these objects, but it also communicates a relationship to land not based on extraction, enclosure, or exploitation, but instead on reciprocity and intergenerational care. So first, let's talk a little bit about the Klamath River Dam story. The object that the Yurok Tribe has chosen, and again, just imagine I do this every time I say object, is the nepui, which in my language we would call shika, the salmon. The Klamath River is a deeply, deeply sick river. And to communicate this, I'd like to pull out a piece from High Country News, which was written in 2018. I'd like to share a really evocative quote from this article that hung in my heart. Remnants of the fish kill lingered for weeks as Cordalis and fishermen up and down the river looked on in shock. By the end of it, California and the Hoopa Valley, Yurok and Yurok tribes made a conservative estimate of the toll. 34,000 dead salmon along the Klamath. Though officials and the sheer volume made a true count difficult. It was the largest fish kill both in Yurok and US history, and its cause was no mystery. Earlier that year, the federal government had capitulated to public pressure from farmers and ranchers in the Klamath Basin and diverted water from the river to irrigate fields. The resulting low flows created a marine environment where fatal diseases could fester. In juxtaposition to that, I'll share a quote from an elder, a Yurok elder. Anytime you're fishing, it's an amazing thing. You know, you put your hands in that water to pull out that fish. It's not just your hands, it's your grandpa's hands and your great-great-grandpa's hands. And you're doing the same thing for generations. Since time began, your people have done it. So on the one hand, we see this devastating loss of not just a food system, but a conceptual and hereditary link to our genealogy, to our ancestry. It is an ecological relationship that has suddenly been broken with the prioritization of agricultural needs over the continuation of the species in this watershed. So when the Yurok tribe chose this object, being their salmon, but not just salmon, the Yurok language word for salmon, nepui, they insisted that this fish is more than a fish. They are alluding to the generations long lineage, the DNA that they share with our salmon. That word translates to what we eat in Yurok, but it's also so much more. It's the lifeblood of the Yurok people. And community accounts claim it's central to their identity, which I, of course, can sympathize with. And as Yurok tribal members are rediscovering their interdependency on salmon, they're also reclaiming their language, their ceremonies, their redwood canoes, and other cultural traditions through this battle. So on the brink of winning the largest dam removal in US history, unfortunately, the Trump administration obviously threw some real nasty curveballs, prioritizing the farmers' overuse of the water storage, and further jeopardizing the existence of salmon in these rivers. Moving on to the Snake River. I should mention as well, actually, that I have a particular love and solidarity with the Yurok people, because one of my good friends, Sammy Gunsa, was a close ally of mine in our first Indigenous youth delegation to the Global Climate Accords in Madrid, Spain, at the end of 2019. Unfortunately, Sammy wasn't able to visit with us in Spain, but the preparation that we did as delegation members was integral to my understanding of the power of Indigenous youth from across the Western Hemisphere coming together to advocate for global climate justice. So speaking specifically now towards the Snake River in the story of the Nez Perce canoe. To me, again, this is also very personal because I was deeply impacted from the first time that I got to row in a traditional canoe with my community. Because a canoe is not just a boat. A canoe is not just even a sacrifice from a true relative, but it is the motion of using all of your muscles to push through water. It's the rhythm and the pattern of matching the person, the community member, maybe your auntie or uncle sitting in front of you. It's the songs that you sing as you paddle in that canoe. It's the tension in the air that our ancestors might have felt paddling in war canoes off to battle. And it's the abundance and the happiness and joy that our ancestors might have felt as they paddled canoes full of trading goods back to tend to our families and feed our bellies. I believe some folks who are with us have had a chance to watch a film created particularly on this Nez Perce canoe, titled A Healing Journey. If folks want more information while I talk, you can also check out an article by Earth Justice titled When a Canoe is More Than a Canoe. And so this particular object, which is reanimated and brought to life through this Indigenous worldview, is a style of dugout canoe made of ponderosa pine that was initially created at the Nez Perce tribal facility in Idaho. It was carved on the reservation by tribal members and youth for the first time in 113 years. And it represents one community's efforts to heal their ancestral waters and heal the next generation. In the short film, which I recommend everyone watches, you can witness first-person lived experience and storytelling of the significance, particularly for the youth, what it meant to learn how to carve a canoe, how after hours they would find themselves gathering around the tents where this canoe was, instead of cruising around the res like a lot of us might have been used to in our youth. Instead, by coming together to carve, to recreate the motions of generations past for the first time in 100 years. It was not just, of course, the creation of a boat, but it was the act of carrying the present generation and future generations towards healing, away from the generational trauma that we've inherited by the dispossession of our lands and the prosecution and persecution of our peoples. But this particular canoe has now been posited in juxtaposition to the 4 dams that breach the watershed, the Columbia River, being the Ice Harbor, Little Goose, Lower Monumental, and Lower Granite Dams. The Nez Perce Tribe advocates strongly for the removal of these dams, which would allow for improved migration and reproduction of salmon, as well as steelhead and lamprey, which are considered foods and medicines of enormous cultural and spiritual significance. The third piece that I want to bring in here, and of course, I'll never be able to do justice to all of these elaborate stories, not being a tribal member of these other communities myself, but I hope that this is a little snippet that we can dive into together, maybe in our conversation or question and answer. So for the Salish Sea campaign, which of course is particularly pertinent to our listeners here, the killer whale totem carved by Jewel James and the House of Tears carvers is a powerful symbolic and cultural resistance to the desecration of the killer whale population in the Salish Sea. For years now, the House of Tears carvers of the Lummi Nation have carved and transported totem poles across North America to raise awareness about environmental threats and threats to public health. And the most recent totem pole features a very specific killer whale, which is one of the Lummi's most revered relations. This totem pole is not behind museum glass. This totem pole is not, barred off by rope. This totem pole has a living spirit that is both reciprocally imbued and giving spirit to its community members. And as this totem pole travels, which I hope some folks might have been exposed to this, in Whale People, Protectors of the Sea, another short film that I encourage people to look out for. The spiritual significance, the cultural practices that encircle and embrace this totem pole are powerfully evocative of the burgeoning strength of this Indigenous community. This killer whale totem was particularly dedicated to what in my language we would pronounce as Salish Sea, an orca who was violently abducted from her pod about 50 years ago, and since then has been imprisoned at Sea Aquarium in Miami, Florida. And so this totem pole and the production that it has garnered as it travels is also a really important legal pressure on an ongoing lawsuit to reclaim the orca relative from Miami. And so this repatriation of this specific orca is one and the same, as well as the restoration of the watershed for coho salmon. It is one and the same as the restoration of the practice of totem pole carving for the community. And so again, that film is Whale People, Protectors of the Sea. I really hope folks do that research and self-educate to learn more about how to support all of these issues. But lastly, I'll end with the Pebble Mine and its related struggles in Alaska. Now, for the Pebble Mine, the object that we have identified, is a traditional fish camp, which of course could never be a single object because it's a place, it's a site, but it's also a concept that holds memory. Now, what stands apart in the Pebble Mine story is that, believe it or not, we have actually encountered some extraordinary wins in the past few months in a 30-year-old campaign. Pebble Mine is not dead. but it is debilitated. And now with the new administration in place, President Biden has made promises that within the first few days of his new administration, the Army Corps of Engineers permits will be denied, and that there will be protections put in place for the Bristol Bay watershed to preserve the salmon runs. And we believe in that on good faith, because just yesterday, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the Tongass Forest, two other sites of desecration and resource extraction, were protected. And so when we first heard news about a month ago of the Army Corps moving in opposition to then President Trump, we met as a team of the Natural History Museum to discuss what this means. Well, should we move away from Pebble Mine? Should we focus on the Arctic Refuge, which unfortunately did recently open to lease sales before Biden's moratorium, which just happened yesterday? And to me, this sudden dissimilarity of being a struggle in action did not make this site any less important to include in a chronology of what resistance looks like, because the chronology that we want to draw is not linear, but instead explores, it spirals and it grows. And what I mean by that is that we must continue to include the Pebble Mine story and the Bristol Bay story in conjunction with these other three ecological justice fights, because if we cannot begin to conceptualize what success might look like, what victory for the protection of the lands and waters might look like, then our timeline, our chronology, our category is extremely self-limiting. And so Pebble Mine offers an example of the power of Indigenous futurities, where we not only imagine, but then subsequently enact the liberation and the resistance that we are fighting, for. And so with that, I want to go into a little bit more analysis. I'll be transparent. I have been out of school for a few years, and going through these texts, I was both thrilled and inspired and intrigued, but also felt like I was up late at night cramming for a last minute essay. So I'm excited to further engage with our participants and with Professor Warburton into these concepts. But first, of course, I must start with some insights from a really sweet and precious elder, Luke Titus, who is from the interior, from Lower Tanana Dene lands. And earlier in 2020, when we were having a discussion about what is resiliency, the definition he gave is, it is something good on the inside coming out. And I want to return to this as we move into more of this exploration. I was often yelled at by an anthropology professor that nothing means on its own. And that's very true. But there's a long genealogy of the complicated ways that settler colonialism has relegated Native Americans into erasure. Now, this hasn't just happened with genocide. It hasn't just happened with assimilation and rewriting of history, but it has specifically and aggressively happened with Indigenous ways of knowing and systems of knowledge that have been forced into a supremacist ideology, into a hierarchy, so that the spirit that we imbue a totem pole with is suddenly, in a Western colonial perspective, transformed into a carved tree. Or a hlika, a salmon, one that feeds us, is transformed into a fish. And so one aspect that I wanted to bring up, which I know some of the students listening might have had a chance to engage in, is the work particularly of Jean-Sean Coulthard in Redskin White Mass, Rejecting the Colonial Politics of Recognition. And the piece that I want to pull out is the notion of grounded normativity, which is defined as the modalities of Indigenous land-connected practices and longstanding experiential knowledge that inform and structure our ethical engagements with the world and our relationships with human and non-human others over time. He follows that. I mean, what is at stake is this grounded normativity in these conflicts of dispossession. And so these modalities of Indigenous-based land connection, these practices and traditions and cultural techniques that imbue and embody that connected relationship is what is particularly important to geography and challenging the discipline that we bring to museums, that we bring to objecthood, and asking us to rethink land as a system of reciprocal relationships and obligations. And so I'm encouraging us to expand this grounded normativity to also include material culture and objecthood, because this approach to land, methodology, and theory building has the potential to crucially reorient, respatialize, and repoliticize dispossession within settler colonialism as the disruption, dislocation, and elimination of ways of being. But I think that the intervention that is then made available when we begin to expand the categories that we've been fed by a Western perspective is by pointing out the faults and the failures of this Western colonial system to destroy these indigenous ways of engaging with land, waters, and objects. And so as we urge our Native communities to return to their traditional political values, to educate a new generation of leaders committed to preserving Indigenous nationhood, we also encourage this new engagement with objecthood and the way that we even view these political struggles. And this, I guess, so another piece that I wanted to bring in, and I know I'm running out of time as well, but a piece that I wanted to bring in is what happens when we exploit this colonial failure to see these alternative worlds and these indigenous perspectives. What happens when we use this chink in the armor to say, well, you're treating this fish like a fish, but it's not a fish. It is a psyche that can communicate so much in this movement of opposition to the way that you hope to relegate and dominate over this animal and this watershed. And when we begin to attribute the same value, the same preciousness, and the same importance to all the subjects of our interconnectivity and our networks, then we begin to realize that we have not just dialectical allies, but we also have physical claims that can be used to strengthen efforts of land and watershed protection. And so all of that's to say, the last thing that I'll end with here, and believe me, I have plenty more to bring up, is again, knowledge and wisdom in the Benti Kanaga language, kotrasne, which means remembering forward. By remembering the indigenous ideologies that nurtured and loved us into existence, that gave us rich and tender cultures that know and understand how to care for the land, but also how to rigorously and scientifically understand the land, we can expand our discursive landscape in which movement building is formed, so that we can use all of these beautiful and powerful tools at our disposal to fight for the rights of the lands and waters that we love. So I'll end there. And Chickenichali, thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you, Ruth. Wonderful. We have a few minutes. Let me quickly say that I've been posting URLs to Ruth's the event page, the Huxley Speaker Series event page for Ruth Miller. So look there, and we'll add some more of those after the talk as well. And then I'd like to invite Teresa to rejoin. And if there are questions, please post them to the chat or the Q&A, and we'll pass them on to Teresa and Ruth for discussion. There was one mention of at least a tip of the hat to the many other peoples, both Indigenous and European settlers who've been working for the dam removal on the Klamath River. And yes, it's a large effort. So
I have a question for Ruth if there's no other
Take it.
Question second. I was thinking, Ruth, as you were showing us the sort of the earrings and the cup that you made, and then talking about, you started with this activity about the body. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the connections you see between the body and art and climate justice, because those seem very connected for you in the talk. And it seems like a bigger theme maybe in the work that you're doing, especially thinking about the totem pole and the work at Lummi, and what are the connections between those things for you in your work?
Well, you've asked a big question, because to me, the connections are, I mean, and you knew this when you asked me, but the connections are insurmountable and difficult to describe because they're so pervasive in every way.
Mm-hmm.
When I think of the health of my ecosystem, I could think physically about the health of the air that I breathe, the health and wealth of the water that I drink, the toxins and the pollutants that are contaminating that water and then leaching into the bodies of the food that I eat, that are hindering our reproductive systems and our respiratory systems, that are leading to high rates of cancer in our rural communities that live in close proximity to development projects. So physically, we can measure and count the very real threat of extraction and continued resource irresponsibility on our bodies. But as these resource extraction projects continue to gain speed and power and become even less responsible, arguably, in their final days, we are also understanding the serious and acute impacts on our bodies that we face disproportionately because of climate change. And so in our communities, we are not only holding up some of the nation's first environmental refugees, climate refugees, but we are also watching as our villages are having to be relocated after millennia because of eroding shorelines, because of rising temperatures. Just as the anecdote that I shared, we are also finding salmon dying in our streams. So physically, we know the very real cost of the climate crisis, but also spiritually, our entire language was created around this specific place. I could not travel to Professor Baker's lands and describe that place in the same way that I can speak to my land here. And so when we create culture that is so intrinsically tied to place, the destruction of that place means the destruction of the people. It means that we will have no more salmon. It means that I won't be able to teach my children how to make these. I won't be able to have them taste the same salmon that I grew up tasting. And it also means that the traditionalism and the important cultural practices that we've preserved for so long will be jeopardized. But I would additionally add that spiritually, we know, we feel in our bodies the ruptures and the wounds of the violence against our lands. And physically, we see it in the disappearance of our mothers, our sisters, our grandmothers, and our daughters. The crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women is directly tied to the resource industry. And we see a hugely increased advent of violence against women, particularly Native women, in our communities close to development sites and close to man camps. So our health, our existence as people, of course, is intrinsically tied in every way to climate justice and the health of our lands. And we, as Indigenous relatives, have a responsibility to the rest of our relatives to fight for the same rights and responsibilities of the lands of others as we would for our own. So I'm honored to be here in allyship and in solidarity with the communities that I've named, but I'm not personally a part of. And I hope that this conversation will continue.
And that ties, there's a question that came in that ties right directly to that, of how do we strike the balance between harvesting of, whether it's the gold and the copper that we use to make the Zoom conversation happen, or the salmon, how do we balance that against the equally important integrity of wild places and heritage and culture?
Well, development is not an alternative to preservation and sustainability. And responsible development in the right places is certainly doable if the time, investment, and particularly cost would be devoted to research and development, to understanding a place and the multiplicities of species that a place might support. But additionally, as we look towards technological progress and moving into the new technological era, we should be directing technology to defend and preserve our lands and waters. And there should be no human cost, particularly not from historically underrepresented and consistently vulnerable and targeted communities, as we begin to make increased scientific progress. Otherwise, that is, to me, not worth it. And so specifically to answer the question about minerals for technology, there should be, in my opinion, a much more extensive industry on mineral recycling projects, and the ways that we can make better use of the resources that we have already extracted. But I would also like to have faith that there will come a time when the technologies that we create will not be created if they cannot be done in a sustainable way. Development in the way that it has been done, colonial and capitalism-based extractive development, is not an inevitability. And I think that that's a really important reminder that we could all stand to hold in our minds. And the way that it has been done is not non-negotiable. And we all have a role in consenting to the future that we make. And so if we would like to see a future that can support technological innovation as well as the protection of lands, we have to understand that we must adopt our policy and our legal processes into a value-based system. We have to decide to prioritize sustainability, prioritize Black and Brown people, prioritize frontline communities, and stop sacrificing them for the growth of these technological industries.
Yes, thank you. So much more to say. That's great. We're over time. I apologize to all the questions we didn't get to, but I will at least send those to Ruth, and we will post more URLs perhaps in response later today, tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to plug quickly next week Adam Huggins and Mendel Skulski, who are co-hosts of a Future Ecologies podcast. We'll be talking on scaling change, imagining future ecologies. So hopefully they will help us also answer the question of, well, how do we get there? Again, thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Teresa.